There's a moment that happens. You're in a room. Maybe it's a boardroom. Maybe it's a family dinner. Maybe it's a casual conversation at a coffee shop. And someone walks in, not the loudest person, not the most talkative, not the most impressive looking. But the moment they enter, something shifts. The energy changes. People straighten up. Conversations pause. Attention moves toward them like gravity. They don't say anything special. They don't command. They don't demand recognition. But they have it anyway. And here's what's interesting. The people in that room can't quite explain it. If you ask them why this person has so much presence, so much power, so much gravitas, they wouldn't be able to tell you. They'd say things like, they're just confident, or they have charisma, or they're just different. But none of that is true. What's actually happening is something most people spend their entire lives trying to achieve and never figure out. This person has learned to be still, not physically still, but mentally still, emotionally still, energetically still. And that stillness, that unshakable calm, is the most powerful presence you can have. Most people think power comes from noise, from talking more, from asserting yourself, from being louder, faster, more aggressive than everyone else. But that's backwards. Real power comes from the opposite. It comes from being so centered, so grounded, so present, that you don't need to do anything to command attention. You already have it. The paradox is, the less you try to influence people, the more they're influenced by you. The less you try to impress people, the more impressed they are. The less you speak, the more people listen. And this isn't luck. This isn't genetics. This isn't something you're born with. This is a practice. This is a skill. This is something the Stoics developed over thousands of years, and something you can learn and implement starting today. And what I'm about to share with you are the 6 specific practices that create this unshakable presence. Not abstract philosophy, but concrete, actionable techniques that literally change how people perceive you and respond to you. Let me tell you about James. James was a senior manager at a Fortune 500 company, smart, accomplished, technically excellent at his job. But he had a problem that was costing him. He couldn't command a room. In meetings, he'd talk a lot. He'd over-explain things. He'd try to convince people by being more articulate, more detailed, more impressive. And every time he did, he'd lose them. They'd look at their phones. They'd check the time. They'd interrupt him. It was like his energy was repelling people instead of attracting them. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. So he did what most people do. He tried to fix it by doing more. He took a public speaking course. He learned better techniques. He became even more articulate. But it got worse, not better. Because the problem wasn't his speaking ability. The problem was his energy. He was trying so hard, pushing so hard. The effort was visible and it made people uncomfortable. Then something changed. He had a mentor, an older guy who ran the parent company. And this mentor had something James didn't have: presence. When this mentor walked into a room, people paid attention. Not because he was louder or more articulate, but because he was calm. He'd listen more than he'd talk. He'd pause before responding. He'd never seem rushed or desperate to convince anyone. And somehow that made him more persuasive, not less. James asked him what his secret was. And the mentor said something simple. I stopped trying to convince people and started being willing to let them make their own choices. That one sentence changed everything. James realized his problem wasn't that he wasn't good enough at convincing. His problem was that he was trying to convince. And the moment he stopped trying, something flipped. He started pausing in meetings instead of filling silence. He started listening instead of explaining. He started being comfortable with people disagreeing with him. And slowly, people started following him more, listening to him more, respecting him more. Not because he got better at presenting, but because he became still. 3 years later, he was promoted to VP. Not because he was the smartest person in the room, but because people wanted to work for him. People wanted to follow him. Because he had learned the power of stillness. Here's the reality that most people never understand. The average person is noisy. Not just audibly noisy, though many are, but energetically noisy, mentally noisy. They're constantly trying, constantly pushing, constantly performing, constantly working to get people to like them, respect them, follow them. And that constant effort creates a kind of static, a kind of desperation that people can feel. And desperation repels people. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them want to move away. But the person who's learned to be still, they don't have that static. They're not trying to be liked. They're not trying to convince. They're not performing. They're just there, present, grounded, unmoved. And that quality, that unshakable presence, creates the exact opposite effect. People are drawn to it. People trust it. People follow it. Think about the people in your life who have the most influence over you. Not the loudest people, not the most talkative people, not the ones who are constantly trying to convince you. It's the people who are calm, the people who don't seem shaken by much, the people who can disagree with you and not need you to validate them. Those people have power. And they have power precisely because they're not trying to have power. This is a fundamental principle that most of society gets backwards. We're taught that power comes from aggression, from assertion, from being bigger, louder, more dominant. But the truth is the opposite. Power comes from being so centered that you don't need to assert anything. People give you power because your presence alone commands respect. The strongest person in the room isn't the one talking the most. It's the one who's listening. The most influential person isn't the one trying hardest to convince. It's the one who's comfortable not convincing. The most powerful person isn't the one seeking attention. It's the one who has no need for it. And here's what most people miss. You can develop this. You don't have to be born with it. You don't have to be naturally charismatic. You don't have to be extraordinarily talented or accomplished. You just have to understand the mechanism of how presence works. And once you understand that, you can build it, practice it, strengthen it, like a muscle. The Stoics developed 6 specific practices that, when applied consistently, create this unshakable presence, this stillness, this power. And what's fascinating is, these practices don't require you to change who you are. They don't require you to become someone else. They just require you to become more centered in who you already are. Let me show you how most people try to build presence and why it doesn't work. Most people think the solution is to be more confident, more articulate, more impressive, more accomplished. So if they chase achievements, they get degrees, they build credentials, they accumulate accomplishments. And sometimes it works. They do become more impressive. But here's what's weird. They still don't have presence. They still walk into a room and have to work to get attention, have to work to get respect, because presence isn't about being impressive. It's about being settled. I knew a guy, Richard, who was incredibly accomplished. PhD from Stanford, founded 3 companies, had a net worth in the 9 figures. By every objective measure, he was impressive. But when he was in a room, he felt compelled to mention his accomplishments, to drop his credentials, to make sure people knew how smart and successful he was. And it made people uncomfortable. Because what he was really communicating was, I need you to know how impressive I am. And that neediness, that desperation to be validated, undermined everything else about him. Compare that to a mentor I had once, incredibly successful guy. But you'd never know it from talking to him. He didn't mention his accomplishments, didn't brag, didn't need to prove anything. And somehow, that made him more impressive, not less. Because he was communicating, I know who I am, and I don't need you to validate it. That's the difference between trying to build presence and actually having it. Another common approach is to try to manipulate people, to use techniques, to play a game. People learn power moves. They learn how to use eye contact, how to speak slower, how to take up more physical space, how to dress for power. And sometimes these things help a little, but they're all missing the core thing, which is that people can feel when you're performing. People can sense when you're using a technique on them. And the moment they sense that, they shut down. They become defensive. Because nobody wants to be manipulated. Everybody wants to be respected as a human being. So the person who's using techniques, even if those techniques are sophisticated, is still being inauthentic. And inauthenticity repels people. It creates distance. Whereas the person who's genuinely centered, genuinely grounded, doesn't need techniques. They're not performing. They're not manipulating. They're just being real. And realness is magnetic. The third approach people try is aggression. They think power is about dominating, about being stronger, faster, more aggressive than everyone else. So they push, they assert, they compete. They try to win every conversation, every interaction. And sometimes that works in specific contexts. If you're in actual physical combat, aggression might help. But in most modern contexts, in meetings, in relationships, in leadership, aggression creates resistance. It makes people defensive. It makes them want to push back. The person who's calm, who's not threatened, who doesn't feel the need to assert dominance, that person actually wins. Because they're not creating resistance. They're creating respect. Here's what all of these failed approaches have in common. They're all based on doing something, adding something, performing something, asserting something. But the Stoic approach is the opposite. It's about subtracting. It's about removing the noise. It's about becoming still. And that stillness, that centeredness, is what creates real presence. The Stoics understood something fundamental about human psychology that most people still don't get. They understood that people are incredibly sensitive to internal state. You can't hide your actual internal state for very long. People can feel it. If you're desperate, they feel it. If you're confident, they feel it. If you're centered, they feel it. If you're scared, they feel it. It's like an energy that radiates from you, and people pick up on it whether you're conscious of it or not. Most people don't understand this, so they try to project an image of confidence while internally feeling desperate. But people sense the incongruence. They feel the inauthenticity, and it creates discomfort. The Stoic approach is different. Instead of trying to project a false image, you actually change your internal state. You become the thing you're trying to appear to be. And when your internal state is genuinely centered, genuinely grounded, genuinely at peace, that radiates outward, and people respond to it. The core principle the Stoics worked with is what they called indifference to externals. It means you don't stake your well-being on things you can't control. Most people do the opposite. They stake their entire sense of self-worth on things they can't control. They need people to like them. So they're constantly anxious about whether people are liking them. They need people to respect them. So they're constantly working to impress. They need people to follow them. So they're constantly trying to convince. That dependence on external validation creates constant anxiety, and that anxiety shows. People feel it, and it repels them. But the Stoic approach is, you don't stake your well-being on whether people like you, respect you, or follow you. You only stake your well-being on things you actually control, your effort, your integrity, your character. And when you're not dependent on external validation, something amazing happens. You stop being anxious, you stop being desperate, you become still, and that stillness is powerful. Another core principle is what the Stoics called virtue or excellence of character. The idea is, the only thing that truly matters is that you're a good person, that you're acting with integrity, that you're aligned with your values. Not whether you win, not whether you get rich, not whether you're famous, not whether people like you, but whether you're good. When you anchor yourself to that, when your sense of self-worth comes from your integrity, not from external outcomes, something shifts. You become unshakable, because nobody can take your integrity from you. Nobody can vote it away. Nobody can invalidate it. It's entirely in your control, so you're not fragile. You're not dependent. You're not anxious. You're solid. And that solidity creates presence. The third piece is understanding what the Stoics called dichotomy of control. There are things you control and things you don't. Things you control, your effort, your focus, your values, your character, your reaction. Things you don't control, the outcome, other people's opinions, whether you win, whether people respect you, whether you get what you want. Most people spend their energy trying to control the uncontrollable. They're anxious about outcomes. They're desperate for approval. They're worked up about whether they'll win. And that constant struggle against things they can't control creates stress and anxiety. But when you understand this dichotomy and focus your energy only on what you can control, something happens. You become less anxious. You become more effective. You become still, because you're no longer fighting against reality. You're moving with it. So what does this look like in practice? It looks like you do your job really well. You give your best effort. But you're not attached to whether you get promoted. You speak your truth in a meeting. You communicate honestly. But you're not attached to whether people agree with you. You do the right thing. You act with integrity. But you're not attached to whether people recognize it. You work hard on a project. You give your all. But you're not attached to whether it succeeds. That doesn't mean you don't care. It means you're not dependent on the outcome for your sense of self-worth. And that freedom, that independence from external validation, creates an internal state of calm. And that calm radiates outward. So here are the 6 specific practices that create unshakable stillness. Practice 1. The pause. This is the foundational practice. And it's simple, but it's incredibly powerful. The practice is, before you speak, pause. Not a long pause, just a moment, 1 or 2 seconds. Most people speak immediately. They react. They fill silence. They're constantly in motion. But when you pause before speaking, something shifts. First, you give yourself time to think. So you speak more thoughtfully, more clearly. You're not just reacting. Second, you create space. And that space is powerful. People pay more attention to you because you're not filling every moment with noise. Third, you communicate that you're not desperate. A desperate person talks fast and fills silence. A centered person can be comfortable with silence. So the pause does 3 things at once. It makes you more effective, it creates more presence, and it communicates that you're centered. Here's how to practice it. In every conversation today, before you respond to something, pause. 1 breath. That's it. That pause will feel awkward at first. But notice what happens. Notice how people respond differently when you pause before speaking. They listen more carefully. They take you more seriously. Within a week, this becomes natural, and it fundamentally changes how people perceive you. Practice 2. Command your attention. This practice is about controlling where your attention goes, not where it's pulled. Most people's attention is scattered. They're in a conversation with you, but they're thinking about their to-do list. They're looking at their phone. They're worried about the next meeting, so they're not fully present. And people sense that. The practice is, wherever you are, be fully there. If you're in a conversation, be in that conversation. Not thinking about anything else. Not half listening, but fully present. If you're in a meeting, be in that meeting, fully focused. Not checking your email. If you're listening to someone, actually listen. Not planning what you're going to say next, but genuinely hearing them. This single shift, from scattered attention to full presence, changes everything about how people perceive you, because people can feel whether you're actually paying attention to them or just performing the appearance of attention. And when you're genuinely present, they feel it. They feel valued, they feel heard, and they become more drawn to you. How to practice. Choose one interaction per day where you commit to being fully present. No phone, no distractions, just full attention. Notice how different the interaction feels. Notice how the other person responds. Then expand it. 2 interactions. 3. Eventually, it becomes your default state, and your presence in conversations becomes noticeably different. Practice 3. Silence is strength. This is where it gets really interesting. Most people are afraid of silence. Silence feels awkward. Silence feels like failure. So they fill it. They talk, they explain. They keep talking until the other person agrees or validates them. But this is exactly backwards. Silence is powerful. Silence is strong. When you can be comfortable in silence, when you don't need to fill it, you communicate something powerful. I'm secure enough that I don't need you to validate me. And that security is magnetic. The practice is, learn to be comfortable with silence in conversations. When there's a pause, don't fill it. Let it sit. Be okay with that. If someone disagrees with you, don't immediately jump in to convince them. Let the silence sit. Let them sit with their own thoughts. What happens is remarkable. People often come around on their own. They often realize you were right. But more importantly, they develop more respect for you because you weren't desperate to convince them. You were secure enough to let them make their own decision. How to practice. In your next 3 conversations, consciously resist the urge to fill silence. Let pauses happen. Notice how uncomfortable it feels at first, but also notice how people respond. Notice that people actually listen more carefully when you're not constantly talking. Notice that your words have more weight when you don't throw too many of them around. Within a week, silence becomes your ally instead of your enemy. Practice 4. Emotional detachment. This one is crucial and often misunderstood. Emotional detachment doesn't mean you don't care. It means you're not emotionally destabilized by outcomes. Most people are emotionally tossed around by what happens. Someone rejects them, they're devastated. Someone criticizes them, they're deflated. Someone disagrees with them, they're rattled. That emotional instability shows, and it undermines your presence. But when you're emotionally stable, when you can receive criticism without being shaken, when you can face rejection without being devastated, when you can deal with disagreement without being rattled, that stability is powerful. The practice is develop emotional resilience, not by suppressing emotions, but by understanding them. When someone criticizes you, notice the emotional reaction. Notice the urge to defend. Notice the urge to prove them wrong. Notice the hurt. But don't act on it immediately. Pause. Wait for the emotion to pass. Ask yourself, is this criticism valid? If it is, what can I learn? If it's not, why do I need to convince them they're wrong? Usually, one of 2 things happens. Either the criticism is valid and you learn something, or it's not valid and you don't actually care whether they believe you or not. Either way, you've created space between the stimulus and your response. And in that space, you get to choose how you want to show up, not as a reactive, emotionally tossed around person, but as someone stable and centered. How to practice. The next time someone criticizes you or disagrees with you, practice pausing before responding. Don't immediately defend. Don't immediately get emotional. Give yourself time to process. Usually, the intensity of the emotion will pass if you give it space. And notice how different you show up when you're not emotionally reactive. Practice 5. Reputation indifference. This is a big one. Most people are deeply invested in their reputation. They're constantly worried about how they're perceived. They're constantly managing their image. And that anxiety about being perceived a certain way is exhausting, and it shows. The Stoic practice is, you don't stake your self-worth on your reputation. You do the right thing. You act with integrity. But you're not attached to whether people recognize it. Some people will like you. Some will dislike you. Some will misunderstand you. And you're okay with that. Because your sense of self-worth doesn't come from their perception. It comes from your character. When you truly integrate this, when you stop needing people to see you a certain way, something shifts. You become less defensive. You become less performance-y. You become more authentic. And authenticity is powerful. How to practice. Identify one area where you're overly concerned with your reputation, where you're performing, where you're managing your image, and consciously stop. Stop trying to convince people you're smart. Stop trying to show people you're successful. Stop trying to prove you're likable. Just be yourself. Notice how liberating that feels. Notice how much energy you free up. Notice how paradoxically, people actually respect you more when you're not trying to convince them to respect you. Practice 6. Purposeful restraint. This is the capstone practice. It's about choosing what you engage with and what you don't. Most people say yes to everything. They engage with every provocation. They respond to every criticism. They fight every battle. But that constant engagement, that constant reactivity is exhausting, and it shows. The Stoic practice is, be very selective about what deserves your engagement. Some things don't deserve your energy. Some conflicts aren't worth fighting. Some criticisms aren't worth responding to. Some provocations aren't worth engaging with. When you're very selective about where you put your energy, something interesting happens. The energy you do put out becomes more powerful. It has more weight. People realize, if this person is engaging with this, it must be important. Versus the person who engages with everything. People realize that person will engage with anything, so nothing they do is particularly meaningful. Also, by not engaging with everything, you stay more centered. You're not emotionally activated by every little thing. You're calm, you're still, and that calmness is powerful. How to practice. The next time you feel the urge to engage, to respond to a criticism, to correct someone, to fight a battle, pause. Ask yourself, does this deserve my energy? Is this aligned with my values? Will engaging make me more or less centered? Usually the answer is, it doesn't deserve your energy. So you don't engage. You stay focused on what matters. And notice how this changes your presence. Notice how people respond when you're not reactive, not defensive, not engaged in every little conflict. Let me show you what happens when people actually integrate these practices. Sarah was a manager. She was smart, capable, technically excellent. But she struggled with presence. She'd talk too much in meetings. She'd over-explain. She'd try to convince people. And it undermined her authority. She started with practice 1, the pause. Before speaking, she'd pause. 1 breath. Immediately, people started paying more attention. Her words had more weight. Then she had practice 2, full presence. She'd actually listen to people in one-on-ones instead of planning her response. People felt heard. They started coming to her more. Then practice 6, purposeful restraint. She stopped responding to every email immediately. She stopped jumping into every conversation. She got very selective about what deserved her engagement. Her team started respecting her more because she was focused. She wasn't scattered. 6 months later, she was promoted. Not because she became more technically skilled, but because her presence changed. Because she became a leader people wanted to follow. Marcus was in sales. He was good at his job, but he was anxious. He wanted the deal too badly. You could feel it. Prospects sensed that desperation and pushed back. He started with practice 4, emotional detachment. He stopped being emotionally attached to whether he made the sale. This freed him up. He could actually listen to what the prospect needed, instead of trying to convince them to buy. Then he added practice 3, silence as strength. He'd present his offer, and then be comfortable with silence while the prospect thought about it. Instead of filling the silence with more pitches, he'd just wait. Remarkably, his close rate went up. Because he wasn't desperate. Because the prospects felt his confidence. His income doubled in a year. David was a writer. He wanted recognition. He was always seeking validation for his work. It made his writing worse because he was writing to impress instead of writing what he actually believed. He started with practice 5, reputation indifference. He stopped trying to write what would impress people. He just wrote what he believed. His writing became stronger, more authentic, more powerful. And paradoxically, he started getting more recognition, not because he was seeking it, but because his work was better. He landed a book deal, not because he was trying to impress the publisher, but because his work spoke for itself. Notice the pattern in every one of these stories? The people didn't become more impressive. They didn't become more skilled. They didn't become more accomplished. What changed is their presence, their stillness, their centeredness. And that internal shift created external results, because presence is contagious. Stillness is powerful. Centeredness attracts people. So how do you actually live this way? The practices I've shared aren't things you do once and you're done. They're things you integrate into your daily life. Here's how. Pick one practice. Just one. Practice it for a week. Don't try to do all 6 at once. Your brain can't integrate that. Do one practice for a week. Notice the changes. Notice how people respond differently. Feel the internal shift. Then add a second practice for the next week. After 6 weeks, all 6 practices are integrated. They become your default way of being, and your presence becomes noticeably different. Here's a daily integration ritual. In the morning, before you start your day, identify which practice you're focusing on that day. Today, I'm practicing purposeful restraint. Then, throughout the day, every time you encounter a situation where that practice applies, you consciously apply it. By the end of the day, that practice is a little more integrated. After a week of that, it's becoming natural. After 2 weeks, it's your default. Here's the beautiful thing about these practices. They're not just about becoming more impressive to others. That's a side effect. The main thing that happens is you become more at peace. You're not constantly anxious about how you're perceived. You're not desperate for validation. You're not emotionally tossed around by outcomes. You're centered, you're calm, you're still. And from that place of internal peace, everything else flows. Your relationships get better because you're fully present. Your work gets better because you're focused and not anxious. Your influence grows because you're authentic and not performing. But the primary benefit is internal. You feel different. You're at peace. So here's what I want you to do. Starting tomorrow, pick one practice. Choose the one that resonates most with you. If you talk too much, pick practice 1, the pause. If you're scattered, pick practice 2, command your attention. If silence makes you anxious, pick practice 3, silence is strength. If you're emotionally reactive, pick practice 4, emotional detachment. If you care too much what people think, pick practice 5, reputation indifference. If you're too engaged with every little thing, pick practice 6, purposeful restraint. Commit to one practice for 1 week. Just 1 week. You can do anything for a week. And notice what changes. Notice how people respond differently. Notice how you feel different. Notice how your presence shifts. Because here's the truth the Stoics understood that we've somehow forgotten. Power isn't something you gain. It's something you reveal. It's not something you build. It's something you uncover by removing what's covering it. All the noise, all the desperation, all the performing, all the anxiety, that's covering your natural power. When you remove that through these practices, what's left is stillness. And stillness is power. The kind of power where people feel it the moment you walk in the room. The kind of power where you don't have to do anything to command respect. The kind of power that makes people fear your presence, not because you're threatening, but because you're unmoved. That's the kind of power we're talking about. And it's available to you right now, not someday, not after you get promoted, not after you become more impressive. Right now, all you have to do is choose to practice it and watch what unfolds.